I'm Alan Weiss, and this is the writing on the wall. Oh, hello. Didn't know you were here. I always wanted to do that. This is episode 30 of The Writing on the Wall. I'm Alan Weiss. And this one is, let's assume. I want to take on one of the great rubrics of all time, which is you should never assume. You've all heard this. Don't assume or you make an ass of you and me. And people quote this like it is gospel. When I first started my career, I was at Prudential. I worked for a guy named Bob Hall. Bob Hall had the distinction of being the world's worst manager. I mean, he was awful. He used to draw imaginary organization designs on his desk with his finger, and we would have to follow it and replicate what he did. And Bob would always say, never assume. You make an ass of you and me. And we'd all walk out 22 years old writing out, make assume, don't assume, you know. It was stupid then, and it's stupider now. If you don't assume, you're immobilized. And let me ask you a question. Do you make out your will before you go to bed? Or do you assume you're going to get up in the morning? Do you assume the guy in the next lane is not going to swerve and crash into you? I know I do. Do you assume that the waiter in the restaurant does not have typhoid? I think most of us do. Do you assume that Lindsay Lohan and Piers Morgan, whatever his credentials are, and Al Sharpton will someday disappear? I assume they will. At least I hope so. The dialogue goes like this. I assumed you knew. Never assume I know. Okay, then I won't assume that you're as up-to-date and as bright and well-informed as others. Fair enough. You know, the word assume, the verb assume, means to take on. So for example, I assume the risk for the safety of the jewels. I assume responsibility for his education. So assume means to take on an onus, a responsibility. We all take on risk. It's part of life. The key is to take on prudent risk, not imprudent risk. Risk has seriousness and probability. Seriousness is the worst of the two. It's probable in the winter that I'm going to slip somewhere here on the property and fall down. The seriousness is less than a 1. You know, I skin my knee, I hurt myself a little bit, I get up, I dust myself off, I get on. The probability of an airline going down, of a plane going down, is infinitesimal, really, but the seriousness is gargantuan. So risk is really about seriousness, not so much about probability. Preventive action can further reduce the probability. Contingent action can take care of risk, but if a fire occurs, even though the sprinklers work well and you have insurance, the fire has still occurred. So prudent risk involves low seriousness, and it involves preventive actions. I don't know where Bob Hall is today, but I imagine he's forced to make assumptions right to this day. There's this great story about a physicist, an engineer, and an economist who are marooned after a shipwreck on a desert island. And what washes up is a can of peas, and they're starving. But the can, of course, is sealed. And so the physicist says, if we can start a fire by rubbing some sticks together, and we hold the can over it at a certain distance for a certain amount of time, the pressure will build up and should explode the top of the can, but without ruining the beans. The engineer says, if we go up on a rock of a certain height and drop the can on another rock of a certain composition, it should dent it significantly, in fact enough to get the peas out, but not so much as to spoil them or scatter them. And they both looked at the economist, and the economist said, well, first assume a can opener. Koufax, I think you want to eat, and I know you assume you will. Let's go. Koufax, come on, Koufax. Let's go, Koufax. Come on, Koufax. Good boy.